All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to pay close attention about the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. How it is you go into a court of law and you protect your constitutional rights. This is where the odyssey begins, is with the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. Now, this is a student's guide which allows it to be closely examined from precedent case rulings. It gives you more information than just the naked or the simple federal rules. Where I'm going with this is the current dog and pony show, the smoke and mirrors of what the United States Supreme Court in the Congress, the Judiciary Committee of the Congress, is playing out against the American public. You've got this farcical confirmation process going on with Brett Kavanaugh. But what they're not talking about at all, they're not discussing this at all. They're not discussing it a bit. And that is that the heightened pleading rules, where they've imposed these nearly insurmountable standards on pleading your cases before the federal courts and the state courts. Because the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, whether people want to admit it or not, are applicable or apply in the state courts. There was a rule of pleading that is well known amongst the legal profession. It's called notice pleading, giving notice to the party that's being sued or to the party that's being prosecuted what the nature of the claim is against them, what essentially the violations of the law are, and the pleading rules were set up wherein there were not these elaborate and extremely technical forms or drafting of pleadings that have to be imposed upon people giving notice to the parties being sued or to the parties being prosecuted. The factual and legal basis for a lawsuit in notice pleading, you can look this up on the internet, or if you have a rules manual, like I've got many of them. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 8 simply required a simple statement of the basis of the action and the basis of the claim, and in fact, under the laws that existed in the United States for many decades, were that there were no hyper-technical rules of pleading even imposed on attorneys. But that all changed with the case Imbler versus Pacman. Imbler versus Pacman. They imposed these, what they refer to as heightened pleading standards. Well, when they started going down that road, they gave to the judges the power to decide the cases on the facts up front. In other words, if you didn't plead a heightened technical case, an extremely highly specific set of facts, if you didn't plead sufficient facts and highly technical sufficient aspects of the applicable laws, your case gets thrown out. Now, to anybody that understands the role of a judge versus the role of a jury, they immediately understand that the judge is not the fact finder. That's what juries are for, to decide whether they believe somebody, whether they accept the evidence as factual. They decide the factual basis of the lawsuits. That's your right to trial by jury. And then, of course, you've got a couple of other rights called equal protection of the law, and then, of course, the mysterious, elusive due process. The due process of the law under the Federal Rules of Court and the Federal Rules of Pleading, Rule 8, under, of course, the Constitution of the United States. Now, here's where the problem lies. We're having this discussion about 30-year-old allegations of sexual assault. And now apparently there's a second woman that's come forward, and apparently there's even a third. All right. And of course we all know that Bill Clinton and several other allegations against Billy Bob and Jeffrey Epstein and Barack Obama and Gary Hart was a famous one. And many others. Clarence Thomas has been accused of sexual deviance, sexual assault on women, and you know, everybody from the Broderick woman, and I don't know. There's just so many different women through the years that these high-powered government officials have assaulted. The names are, you know, just endless. Monica Lewinsky. There's a good name for you. And you know the other ones. Let's see. Stormy Daniels. Stormy Daniels has got allegations against President Trump. And the list just goes on and on and on. Now, we've got this discussion of a very technical nature, I guess, of the confirmation of a Supreme Court judge. But here's the conversation that's not being had. These newly imposed heightened pleading standards, the heightened pleading standards, and you can look this stuff up and read about it ad nauseum on the internet. It's not a mystery. Just go to the heightened pleading standards and civil rights, and you'll see that unless you can plead a nearly perfect case right up front in the pleading stage without doing any discovery or without doing any depositions or subpoenas, without building your case, unless you can make the hurdle of the pleading standards, the heightened pleading standards, you get thrown out of court. In other words, you don't get any civil rights. And not only do you not get any civil rights, but you don't get any other rights under the law either. You don't get your human rights, that's for doggone sure. The international human rights standards in the United States are totally eviscerated and nullified. They've, just totally done away with them by implementation of the heightened pleading standards. And this little cracker jerk, this frat brat, he's a frat brat, let's get honest here. Brett Kavanaugh, he's not mentioned in any of the heightened pleading rules. And none of the other Judiciary Committee are breathing a word of it either. You're not being told about the heightened pleading standards, which are completely contrary to more than 175 years of Rule 8 pleading, notice pleading. They just did away with it in the case Imbler versus Packman. Now, here's my point. When you do get a case up to the Supreme Court of the United States, when you are able to spend enough money with a lawyer, which generally is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you do get a case filed in the U.S. Supreme Court after going through district court and going through the appellate court, 99% of all U.S. Supreme Court cases are simply thrown in a dumpster. They're not, put in line and, ruled on and analyzed when they're gotten to in a, sequential order. They're not gotten to as the case numbers are gone through. No. They pick about 1% of the cases, and then the other 99% of the cases are literally thrown in the dumpster. And this happens every year. So 99% of the people that fight their way up to the Supreme Court get basically told to take a hike. And how it is they do pick the 1% of the cases is a great big mystery. The great big mystery is they do not review 99% of the cases, and they simply throw them in a trash basket. So 99% of the American people automatically have been denied their constitutional rights. 99% of the American people are simply being stiffed by the United States Supreme Court. You don't get any rights before the Supreme Court of the United States, Incorporated, unless you got enough Federal Reserve notes, and I don't know, apparently you got some stroke with the clerks and the judges on the Supreme Court, or a president or a big corporation. You start examining what kind of cases are being decided and properly analyzed before the Supreme Court of the United States, and you're going to discover that ordinary Americans don't count. Your constitutional rights under the laws of the United States, Incorporated, simply do not count. And Brett Kavanaugh and Maxine Waters and all these other freaking clowns, Dianne Feinstein, the whole Senate and Congressional Judiciary are just not discussing it. They don't want you to know. They don't want you to know that unless you can plead a nearly perfect case, contrary to the simple, plain notice pleading rules of Rule 8, if you can't adhere to the heightened pleading rules under Imbler versus Pacman and its progeny, there's a whole line of cases that have made Imbler versus Pacman insurmountable. You don't get any rights. You have no constitutional, no civil, no human rights, no due process, no equal protection before the Supreme Court of the United States. And man, we're not talking about that at all. Now, the reason I raise the issue is quite simply this. You got more than 325 million people living in the United States. 325 million. And then you got millions more that the conduct and the actions, the policies, customs, and practices of the United States government, Incorporated, affect millions more all over the world. The war-making powers, the financial and credit laws and authorities, the taxing, the regulation, controlling pharmacological drugs, controlling women's reproductive rights, and the list just goes on and on and on and on and on. What the Supreme Court dictates to more than 325 million people by the opinions and rulings of 5 people. When it gets right down to the final analysis, you've got 5 dictators dictating to the rest of the country. 5 people. A majority court. 5. That's all it takes. And this is after 99% of all cases get thrown in the trash. They don't rule on them. They don't analyze them. They don't discuss them. And they don't publish any opinions. They just throw them in the dumpster. Now, if that's not like sexual abuse, violent sexual abuse against 99% of the American people, I don't know what the hell is. So I'm going to end this video because I'm getting a little bit long. But I want you to take a long, close, hard look. I want you to wake up America and ask yourself the hard question. How is it that the 1% of the cases are picked? Why is it those 1% of the cases, while 99% of Americans' cases are just thrown in a trash bin? They're thrown in the trash bin. They're thrown in the trash can. How is it that 99% of all Americans simply don't have any rights? They don't have any rights before the U.S. Supreme Court. And by the time you get up to the Supreme Court, the district court, the appellate court has already stripped you of your rights. You've been it's called court stripping. Wonderful article by Anthony Lewis, Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter, freelance journalist, and worked many times for some of the biggest news outlets in the world. Anthony Lewis, he refers to it as court stripping. And then, you can go to the Mises, or some people call it Mises, M-I-S-E-S, and read the opinions of the Mises Institute on how totally out of control and way too powerful the Supreme Court is. You've got 5 people that are dictating to over 325 million, plus huge numbers of other people throughout the world. You got 5 people that are dictators. And 99% of the American people, you don't have any constitutional rights. You just think you do. Now, Donald Trump, you want to talk about a swamp? You want to talk about how everything's rigged? Let's talk about how the United States Supreme Court is a supreme swamp and a supreme con job and is supremely rigged. Let's talk about that, Donald Trump. Mike Pence, Christopher Wray, Maxine Waters, Dianne Feinstein. Let's talk about this level of, I call it treason, actually. These people are traitors. They're distracting you with this dog and pony show while they're not telling you that 99% of you just don't count. Try going to a restaurant where they ignore 99% of their customers. Or, I don't know, go down to an automobile repair shop where they, ignore 99% of their customers. Or to a hospital, if there's one for you. Go down to a hospital and see how long that you'll wait around if you know that 99% of the people that go to that hospital, they're just thrown in the dumpster. Now, America, you got fake money. They've stripped you for your Fourth Amendment rights. They've basically stripped you for your Fifth Amendment rights. Your First Amendment rights are under attack like never before seen. They want to take your guns. The Second Amendment's basically been eviscerated. This idea that you have constitutional rights in this nation, not when 99% of the cases get thrown in the dumpster. And a closing remark, Brett Kavanaugh's not whispering, not a breath of this matter. He's totally silent. He's not talking about what this video's about. He hasn't even questioned it. Because, Brett Kavanaugh, you're part of it. You're part of those heightened pleading standards. Let's take a look at his record on how many times he's imposed the heightened pleading standards on the American public. There'd be that'd be a fireworks. How about it, Brett Kavanaugh? How many times have you imposed the heightened pleading standards where you become the fact finder, where you determine the factual sufficiency or the factual insufficiency of a case under the heightened pleading rules, which, by the way, go way beyond Rule 9. You got Rule 8 and Rule 9, which affect your pleading standards in the federal courts. And trust me, I'm very familiar with the rules. All right, folks, we'll leave it right there. As always, hasta la vista. God bless. And I don't have any choice here, folks. I'll be coming back. Ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful day.